There is this so-called discussion at the moment with certain political personalities or personalities for that matter that, there's such a thing as, an impending threat, impending threat from China. I think it talks about military.
Well, if China wanted really to threaten the Philippines, it should have done that years back and taken over the Philippines. I'm sorry to say. Let's look at it more positively. Right now, I would like to suggest to the policymakers of the Marcos administration to reinvigorate the bilateral dialogue mechanisms between China and the Philippines that was established between the Duterte government and Xi Jinping way back in 2017 to resolve all pending bilateral conflicts, including the South China Sea and so on and so forth. But then again, just 1 or 2 weeks ago, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, came to the Philippines, and both Wang Yi and President Marcos agreed that the South China Sea issue is not the sum total of Philippine-China relations. We have other matters to deal with, like trade, economic cooperation, people-to-people, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. No? Let not the South China Sea be the stumbling block to possible opportunities of cooperation under the new administration. I'd rather look at it. Well, historically, I can say right now that, in fact, China since 1949 has been able to resolve 24 of its 27 territorial disputes peacefully without resorting to any military action. And the objective of those negotiations were to really to come up with a treaty of non-aggression and a peace agreement. So that's why I say that let us be more productive, more constructive, and use the available mechanisms that are there. It's unfortunate that Philippine ambassador to China, Chito Santa Romana, who did his best to use these mechanisms, passed away last April, and there's I think no new ambassador has been appointed to Beijing.
Yes, thank you, Professor Bobby. Dr. Dan, what's your opinion on this? That the Marcos administration is to uphold 2016 arbitral award, but still engage with China in terms of economic projects, and the AFP is intensifying or trying to modernize our defense capabilities to offer deterrence at the same time. But usually some personalities would refer to that deterrence, and the object of that deterrence is the so-called impending threat from China. So what's your reaction to this? And what's your perspective? Is there some truth to it that, there's such a thing as a China threat to vis-a-vis the Philippines?
If I can ask Austin to take back the slide on the independent foreign policy in the Philippines, I think that threat picture has been exaggerated almost out of extinction here. I think it's very unfortunate and potentially worrisome in that it is almost as if the previous administration, and I do not mean the Duterte administration, but the Aquino administration, which made the deals, for instance, with these pogos and these gamers to come to Philippines, and gave basically an illicit industry in China free room to maneuver, something that President Duterte was against, but there was a very difficult situation in the early days of the pandemic, so that was allowed. Sometimes I can't help but wonder, why would you make a deal with this kind of an industry at that kind of a time, when there's so much talk about arbitration and the use of that decision? Unless, of course, you want to have a scapegoat, a physical face, a target that you can point out to people and say that they are the reason for your misery. They are the reason for your economic malaise. They are because we are being held back. We saw what happened with this kind of sentiments in the early days of the pandemic. You had an explosion of hate crimes against the Chinese in the United States and somewhat also in Europe. And they didn't stop at that. There were spillovers against all Asians. It reminded me of the terrible days after 9/11 when Indian immigrants, Sikhs, were attacked because people thought that they were possibly Osama bin Laden. Or when a friend of mine who was the Finnish ambassador wanted to enter the United States and his name in Finnish is Osmo. The immigration official thought this is dangerously close to Osama. Let's have an investigation. When people exaggerate these kind of threats, only bad things will ensue. And I think that the slide I offered earlier about the independent foreign policy is relevant. Where does this picture of threat come from? It comes from the images that are being maneuvered by a number of think tanks. They would say that, well, it's just one contingency, it's one scenario. But why then market this scenario on, if not primetime TV, a major political news in the US, NBC News? And why use a year 2027 creating an impression that there's an impending threat and it will take place 2027, especially taking into consideration the fact that that year came from an admiral who was American and who actually had betrayed his own commanding officers by taking a ship out when he was warned not to do so because of the coronavirus. As a result, 600 Americans caught it and 102 died. So I, being a little bit cynical, I'm wondering, was this his way of shaping his own legacy, using this 2027 point as a platform to give congressional testimony when he was not interrogated about his conduct during the pandemic crisis, but his foresight for ASEAN, for Philippines, and so on and so forth? I think that ultimately you simply have to choose. You have to choose between economic development or geopolitics. And if we take that road to geopolitics, at the furthest end of it, we might find ourselves in the situation where some powers will fight with the Philippines to the last Filipino, but that's not necessarily what the Filipinos want. And that's why I think it's so important to concentrate on economic development. Austin found a slide, I won't spend time on this, but that's about Taiwan, but perhaps it's relevant as well. This was a so-called Project 24/9 Institute that was created in the US. The key player in it was Richard Armitage, who had a great role in Iran-Contra debacle in 1980s, a very controversial character. Again, you have the same sponsors, the big defense contractors, and then you have a bunch of other organizations, including Boveri Group Asia, which is connected with the ADRI in the Philippines, Open Society, National Endowment for Democracy, in whose name also Mr. McCain presented himself in Ukraine, 2014. So this path to where we are now has been plotted quite a long while ago. And the objective has been to prevent perhaps the rise of China in this case. And I, for the best of me, don't understand why you can't have both. You can have the rise of China economically. They have very little interest in military. If you look at the military expenditures in China and US and Europe, you will find out that on per capita basis, US is 20 times more, Europe maybe 10 times more. But they are willing to defend what they have achieved, which is only understandable. So that's the one thing we should do whatever we can to avoid the option or the scenario of geopolitics that would surpass the economic objectives. And I don't think that Philippines can afford it.
Thank you, Dr. Dan. But before I move on to the next question in the chat box, let me have a follow-up question for you, Dr. Dan.
Anna, can I give a little input here?
Okay, yeah. Sir. Before my follow-up question to Dr. Dan, let me call on Sir George yes, to have input on the question.
We can look at, since we're talking about BBM Marcos, his father was a master of the dance. Let's call that. Why do I say this as regards to China? You know, if we remember, Marcos opened the relations with China even before the US did, right? So on one hand, he was opening his arms to China and open not only with China but also with Russia and with Libya and so on. On the other hand, he's the first to put in our laws a claim on the Spratlys. No, in 1978, he put two laws for the economic zones and for the territory. So on one hand, it's like dancing with somebody, and on the other hand, you're pickpocketing, right? And we had perfectly good relations. So that's a true diplomat and a true politician. And we had excellent relations with China at that time. So second, for what reason would China be interested in invading the Philippines? There is no interest in invasion of the Philippines, but the Philippines may become a target for different reasons. Why is there no interest in the Philippines? Because if we look at the entire Philippine, if we look at it from an economic basis, the entire Philippine productive capacity, about $370 billion GDP a year, no, is less than one half of 1 year's growth, because China's growth at 6% of a $14 trillion economy, 13, 14 trillion. We're talking about $800 billion a year growth, $800 billion a year growth. So our entire economy is sunk into just one half of a year's growth. For what reason would they risk their entire reputation and have to go through war to take over the Philippines? But there is a reason to possibly attack and invade the Philippines is actually defensive rather than offensive. If we remember, they did not start building on those islands the military capability until the Philippines started saying publicly, very publicly, that they would invite the US to come in and defend those territories against China. Now, it makes it impossible for China politicians not to react to that, because their people will say, you are going to allow the US to come in and tighten the ring noose around us, because the US has already stated that its objective is to keep tightening the ring around China. And so if we have 6 EDCA bases here and negotiating for more, and now there are all these missiles, they have to get at those missiles and attack before they reach maximum velocity. So anyone who understands military will understand that. So they have to be there, whereas they were not there before. If the US is saying that they did not protest before, that is not the case. They have been sending letters and representations and were being ignored by the US and the West, just the same as the Russian proposal to just consider mutuality of security was totally ignored by the US and the EU. Why don't you just agenda it and put it on record? They refused. No, so that is we have to see. In fact, the OSCE, the Organization for Security of Europe, European Community, has agreed in principle many years ago that you cannot enhance the security of one party without considering mutual security of all the parties. And that is what they did. So we have to understand that today, especially for powers, you cannot try to enhance your security at my expense. They will react. In fact, this is also the US policy